Hello, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us again to talk through how Energy Day has gone at COP28. This is the third of the big themed days from the COP28 presidency. We're 2 days post World Leaders Summit now, and the energy in the negotiations had dipped, but it's definitely gone back up again with a draft text for the global stocktake. We've got two of our energy experts to talk you through what's happened on Energy Day, what's been announced in the real world action, and where it's likely to land in the text on that whole energy package. I've got Leo Roberts. Leo, do you want to introduce yourself quickly? And then we'll go to Lisa Fischer, who is our expert on the energy package, particularly on oil and gas. Leo, over to you first.
Sure, thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. I'm Leo Roberts. I'm a program manager in the fossil fuel transitions team at E3G. I've been following the energy package in the run-up to and at COP28, particularly focusing on announcements and pledges around coal and renewable energy, and keeping an eye on the fossil fuel language as it unfolds. I'll just give a couple of words on some of the significant announcements that we've seen more over the last few days than necessarily today, because it's obviously gathers pace as the COP goes on. We've seen a set of really significant announcements over the past few days, particularly around coal and renewables, and these have set the tone for the COP and are having an impact on the negotiations as well. I think the main ones to flag are the USA joining the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is significant in that we've got the world's largest economy committing to phase out the world's dirtiest fossil fuel on a Paris-aligned timeline. So that's really significant. Obviously, I think it's now at 122 countries, but another one may have joined in the last half hour since I checked, have joined the Clean Energy Pledge, which includes language around supporting the tripling of renewable energy and the doubling of energy efficiency. But we've also seen some announcements on finance, which have been important and exciting because there's not going to be any chance of delivering ambitious text on renewable energy, let alone on fossil fuel phase out on coal, unless we see money on the table and mechanisms to support that. So I think the key ones that I would flag there are new members of the Clean Energy Transition Partnership, which is a group of developed countries from the global north who have committed to move money out of fossil fuels, public international finance out of fossil fuels and into renewables. And notably, some members have stepped up their international public financing for clean since joining the Clean Energy Transition Partnership. Some back of the envelope calculations, we reckon there's about 57 billion in financial commitments that have been made since the start of this COP. If we factor in everything that's been announced covering renewable energy deployment, energy efficiency, fossil fuel phase out, and coal phase out specifically. So a big number, but that's across a number of different initiatives and mechanisms. It's scattered. Some of that is conditional. And I think the thing that I would flag is that to land an energy package within the COP, and it is a package, it's not a menu, we need to see all of these parts delivered together. We need to see this noise and momentum that we're hearing around finance outside negotiations translated into confidence inside the negotiations. And what that means is that we need to see clear wording that works for all parties, everybody in the room, that demonstrates that delivering the energy transition will be paid for, and that those countries that require that financial support will have mechanisms for being able to access finance. So I'll stop there. I can answer questions on any of that. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Leo, and please do add your questions into the Q&A function in Zoom. If you'd like to raise a hand, once Lisa's given us her introduction, we can also bring you in to ask your question and answer it live as well. But Lisa, let's get your take on the whole package before we go to questions.
Yeah, hi everybody, from London. I'll be in Dubai from Thursday morning. I'm a program lead at E3G. I'm covering fossil fuels on the one hand, in particular oil and gas and methane, but also been looking at preparing and covering the energy package at large on renewables, efficiency and fossil fuels. Picking up where perhaps Leo left it on sort of the surround sound and what it means for the negotiations. So what I wanted to specifically comment on sort of the surround sound around fossil fuels as well. I think we've seen an interesting imbalance. We've seen a lot of momentum in the clean energy landscape. We've seen the global pledge on renewables and energy efficiency, with I think now up to 123 signatories that has concrete steps on collaboration and forward timeline to 2030. And a few of the things that Leo mentioned, we've also seen a growing support infrastructure, even though it's still insufficient on phasing out fossil fuels on the Powering Past Coal Alliance. We expect more announcements also on the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance and other financial institutions supporting countries in their phase out from fossil fuels, such as the Net Zero Export Credit Agency. But when it comes to sort of the initiatives put forward by the fossil industry and actually also really sponsored by the UAE presidency, we've seen a lack of, in particular, pre-2030 milestones. So we've seen a lack of recognition that we then just need to a little bit clean up fossil fuels, but actually phase them out and then phase them down. So I'm particularly referring here to the Methane Finance Sprint and the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Alliance, where there was a lot of noise, but a lot of it was also reheating old commitments, not concretizing them and not showing progress. In terms of just closing up here, in terms of the negotiations, though, it does mean we've seen leaders really speak up on the need to phase out fossil fuels, on their support for this energy package that also includes tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency. We've seen that also come up in the negotiation rooms from both big countries such as the US and the European Union, Australia, and small countries. And so that has led to now most of those elements really be part of the first drafts on the global stocktake. So with all the elements on the table, and I think all eyes are now on the UAE presidency as an honest broker here, and ministers coming in for the second week to turn that into a coherent and concrete deal that doesn't give in sort of to the sort of greenwashing elements we've seen on the oil and gas side, but really captures that progress on the clean energy side, and on the need to phase out fossil fuels. Back to you, Alex.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And I can see, Rachel, you want to come in with a question. So we'll just unmute you so that you can ask us what you need to know. Go for it.
Yes, thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. It's Rachel with CNN. I saw that the UAE also joined the Powering Past Coal Alliance. Is that symbolic at all or significant since they don't really use coal anymore? I guess, what message does that send? And then separately, I was wondering if you guys could also talk about the CCS language on the draft text of the GST and just kind of your overall reactions on that and sort of the lack of language in terms of just the limitations of CCS use and whatnot. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Leo, it'd be great if you could come in on that Powering Past Coal Alliance, and then Lisa, maybe we'll go to you on the CCS part of the question. Thanks, Leo.
Sure, thanks, Alex. Very good question. Yeah, so the UAE also joined the Powering Past Coal Alliance, along with, I think, 6 other members, new members the other day. I didn't mention the others just because the US is obviously the big one. The US has over 200 gigawatts of coal. I think the interesting thing about the UAE joining, at least that this is the way I would interpret it, is that this is the UAE endorsing a model for phasing out of fossil fuel. To be a member of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, you have to commit to phasing out a fossil fuel, not phasing down a fossil fuel on a Paris-aligned timeline, and this is them doing it. And they actually did have a coal power station that was under construction, which was converted to gas. Now, that's obviously not as good as converting it to renewables, but it does recognize the need to reduce emissions by ending the burning of coal as soon as possible. So this is in no way me endorsing a conversion of coal to gas. That is not a sensible way to do these things. But I would just reiterate the point that the Powering Past Coal Alliance is about phase out, not phase down on a Paris-aligned timeline. And as far as we can see, this is the presidency endorsing that model. So we'd like to see them reflecting that in the way that they're managing the negotiations.
And that's just jumping in, Rachel, on your second question on CCS. So perhaps just for context and background, I mean, it's important to remember that in terms of the numbers, looking at IEA and IPCC numbers, the inclusion of carbon capture and storage or abatement technologies slightly modifies the trajectory for fossil fuels, but it doesn't alter it, and we're still looking at a really steep decline curve. So that's in terms of the numbers. I'm happy to send more detail in a follow-up. The second piece is obviously for some countries it is important in terms of in order to be able to sign up for a phasing out fossil fuel deal to have the word unabated in there, but there are also some countries that strongly oppose that, and the High Ambition Coalition Statement pre-COP has also made that clear that the role these technologies will play, in particular to 2030, is absolutely minimal, and what we need to focus on is concrete steps to 2030. Coming to your actual question, which was about the text, I think what I've seen so far is a reference to phasing out unabated fossil fuels en route to a net zero energy system to around 2050 or something like that. So first thing to note quite specifically that is a bit of a double watering down if you talk about net zero and unabated. I think the second bit is that unabated or CCS, if anything, does need to be part of a deal of phasing out, not phasing down. I think that is the very clear message. And finally, if we start using terms like unabated, they have no clear meaning at the moment, no clear definitions. I think then what we need to see is a way to define in a science-based way what abatement actually means. And what I'm thinking about here are things like capture rates, leakage. These are all very, very big questions associated with that technology. And that's not even talking about the additional costs that come from using that technology.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And please do keep your questions coming. I'm sure that sparks some more questions from people as well. And I can see Abigail wants to come in. Abigail, can you, sorry, Dido, can you unmute Abigail for us? Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Apologies if there's background noise. Hopefully you guys can still hear me. But I just wanted to drill in a little bit more to what you were just talking about on the fact that unabated it doesn't have a definition that is agreed upon. Could you maybe lay out, just so I understand a bit more, the implications of that? What sort of like a worst case scenario is for unabatement? I mean, how far could it go in terms of allowing fossil fuel producers to continue to produce without much, in the way of abatement? Thank you.
Go for it, Lisa.
Yeah, and Leon, please feel free to add. The way I understand your question is, so I think abatement, the first thing to remember is that we've seen very little progress on abatement technologies in the real world, right? And so this is where the first concern comes from. And if we look at the IEA report from this year and the net zero review, it's revised downwards its expectations for CCS significantly, in particular to 2030, because what we've seen in the real world in terms of deployment. So there's a huge project pipeline, but there's very little progress in final investment decisions. And actually, it's a very expensive technology as well that adds significantly to the abatement cost. So we know, again, all the pathways show that a high renewables, high efficiency pathway is much cheaper to the trillions than a carbon capture, a high carbon capture and storage pathway. So that's point number one. Point number two is what we've seen as well is a real difference in real world performance of CCS and the promises. So in terms of actually keeping the emissions underground and not leaking them out and getting to those capture rates that are being promised, like 95%, we actually haven't seen them in a large scale in the real world. So there's a real risk that we actually rely on over rely on a technology that doesn't deliver. And it's also important to bear in mind that methane emissions are not being tackled with if you do CCS. That's only one part. Finally, when it comes to oil, for example, and most uses of oil, carbon capture will make no difference because you can't really fit a little carbon capture device onto every exhaust pipe of a car, if you know what I mean. So obviously there's other uses of oil, but that's one of the most significant uses of oil. So I think the main difference it makes is for gas, really, rather than coal and oil. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is very much also a distraction tactic.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And Leo, I think you'll probably want to come in on that as well. There's also a question about some of the negotiating dynamics behind the options that have been put on the table. We've had a question from Matteo about who's supporting the second option. on the fossil fuel tax, but maybe you could speak more broadly to who we know is for what kind of fossil fuel phase out signal from the cop28 decisions. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll follow up on Lisa's really strong answer a second ago as well by just adding that when it comes to abatement and the fossil fuel phase out and phase down language, I think the interplay between science and politics is really, really important. The science is extremely clear. The politics and the political space to be able to get commitments are much less clear. That's why we have these COPs. That's why they're tricky. That's why we have arguments forming between countries and blocks every year, and we have to keep coming back. So I think the way to frame to aim for fossil fuel phase out, if we're to be able to get to the point that the science says that we can get to it, which is where we have tiny amounts of abatement around the mid-century in certain sectors. But the principle is that if we aim for phase down and we over rely on unproven expensive abatement technologies, including CCS, for example, there's only one commercial scale coal power station with CCS, and it's incredibly expensive to the point that it keeps breaking and turning off. That there's no one willing to build anything else like this in the world because it's too expensive. So if we're going to rely on technologies like this and language like phase down, it's not going to get us to a 1.5 aligned pathway. We have to be politically aiming for phase out by the mid-century in order to be able to get to phase down, or in order to be able to get to the low rates of fossil fuel use that we need, incredibly low rates. So on your question, Matteo, which, as I understand it, was who's supporting what. I mean, I think it's not particularly clear, but I would say that the second option, which you refer to, has a number of blocking words or words that slow down action, which make it considerably less ambitious than the other options in there. So, for example, referring to accelerating is not constructive language. We already know we need to accelerate. In fact, more than that, we know that we need to act immediately. So accelerating may look like a positive word, but actually it's a word that leans towards deferring efforts into the future and hoping that we'll come back to them. And perhaps some of those blockers are hoping that we won't come back to them. And reducing use as well in there. We obviously do need to reduce use, but a commitment to fossil fuel phase out means reducing production and consumption of fossil fuels. So I've kind of avoided your question there because I don't think we can get into the details of who's pushing which positions on here. But just to flag that the option that you've put forward is the less constructive, more blocking position that's being put forward by some of the parties.
Thanks, Leo. And indeed, we've just had the first contact group meeting since this draft text has landed. And the outcome of that was basically, this is a 24-page text of every single option for how we could decide our response to the global stocktake, and we need more time to process it before we can talk this through properly. So indeed, we're waiting till likely tomorrow morning for the next formal negotiation where we see what countries' positions are and which paragraphs they're supporting and which options they're supporting formally. Overnight tonight, there will be informal consultations and there will be bilateral meetings between parties to work through which options they support, which options their allies support, and how they could convince the blockers to come closer to the ambitious outcome that we need to see. Lisa, I'm sure you want to come in on some of those dynamics as well. And also we have a question from John Hay about what we expect the ultimate political outcome to be. What are the variations up or down from the potential likely landing ground? Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Dom. Very easy question, that one. I'll try and add a bit more flavor to Leo's input. And so I think some of the dynamics that we've seen already in the run-up to COP and now at COP around the specific language on fossil fuel phase out includes, on the one hand, again, going back to the question of abatement. So we had a group of the High Ambition Coalition that really says actually don't want abatement in there. And it has a place, but not to 2030. And we want to talk near-term outcomes. There's another group of countries, and I think the UK and Germany and others are in that say, well, we are open to talk about abatement, but with very, very strong guardrails. And this links back to what I said earlier. So this is one of the lines. I think a few other things that we've heard bubbling up. I mean, it comes back to the wider finance package that Leo alluded to earlier. On the one hand, on clean energy finance, where we need to see a clear indication of the intent to scale and also prioritize finance for clean energy, but also the support landscape for countries to phase out fossil fuels and plan and implement the transition is growing. But I would say it's only emerging. So I think that the finance piece is a dimension. Third, I think there's a dimension around equity in that as well, where we're only starting to talk about this on who needs to move first. And there has been some data on 5 developed nations being, still accountable for a large share of the fossil oil and gas expansion plans. So there needs to be a recognition of the need to also move first here. In terms of the ultimate landing grounds and places, I think I'm pretty sure there can be a solution around the abatement question and starting to have a conversation around guardrails in there that will actually really constructively move the conversation forward. I think an interesting actor to watch is China. China has been very careful, I think, around sort of pushing back on sectoral targets in general. But when you look at the statement they did with the US pre-COP, the so-called Sunland statement, they actually have floated some language on phasing out fossil fuels in the power sector, I think. So, Alex, correct me if I got that wrong. But so and have made a reference to the GST text. So there's also some inconsistency actually in the positioning that I think indicates there is room for maneuver. And going back to the global pledge we've seen with 123 countries signed up, that is actually a really strong majority that's tripling versus doubling energy efficiency, and there is a reference to phasing out unabated fossil fuels. I think the other element is around the language on coal in there that I don't know if anyone on the team wants to say more about.
Yeah, Leo, it'd be great if you could come in on where you think that landing ground might be on coal and what might push it up any further as well.
Yeah, sure. And perhaps I can also speak to Abigail's question in the text. So I'd reiterate the point that Lisa made and that I made at the start, which is that the landing ground for the final package that we get is going to be highly contingent on the extent to which the developed countries, the world's wealthiest countries, are able to translate what they're doing outside, which is putting money on the table and building mechanisms for delivering that money, and whether they can translate that into something in the text that will give all parties in the room the confidence to sign up to the full energy package, which is doubling energy efficiency, tripling renewable energy capacity by 2030, but also fossil fuel phase out and coal phase out, and no new coal, and enter the construction of new coal. So this is to say that the finance issue is again at COP at the heart of this. There isn't enough money on the table at the moment. Outside the negotiations, there are lots of mechanisms. They're quite fragmented. They're not being clearly presented enough. So effort needs to be made to close that gap, to build that confidence. The more that confidence can be built amongst the countries from the global south, that they're not just signing up to mitigation targets imposed on them by the global north, they're actually signing up to a means of accessing finance specifically for things that will benefit them and their own development pathways. So I think the finance point is key. On the coal issue, coal, we have the clearest science on in terms of phase out. So we know that we need the world's richest countries to be out of coal by 2030 and the rest of the world by 2040 if we're to stay on track for a 1.5 aligned pathway. Doing that won't get us to 1.5 alone, but without doing that, we are ruining our chances of getting to 1.5. It's absolutely pivotal, which is why it's really important that countries like the US are sending that signal, putting pressure on those remaining rich countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, to also do the same. So in terms of what we would hope to see in the final package is not just fossil fuel language, but something that reflects what I've just said a second ago about the coal phase out dates. And I think that's still very much in play. They're not mutually exclusive. A phased pathway, a pathway to phase out is staged, and we happen to have the clearest science on coal, so coal has to go first, and we have to show that by getting coal text into the language. And then lastly, on Abigail's question, I think normally the way this is done is that there would be, if there's a scientific issue or a technical issue that needs to be referred to in the text, it would refer to the strongest real world example. So the IPCC science is the best example of that. where the text would refer to existing science that has already been agreed and peer reviewed to a sufficient extent. Now, we don't have a global agreement like that on abatement. So the two options would be try to find a space in the text to put something in there, but it's a very technical definition, and that would require a huge amount of negotiation that there probably isn't room for, or open a space to be able to work out what the definitions would be. And there is plenty of space outside in the real world to inform that. So that might be one of the options around the details on abatement and CCS.
And in the meantime, there is very much still an option on the table for an orderly and just phase out of fossil fuels without those caveats. And there are definitely still countries, still parties who are pushing hard for that outcome to be the unequivocal, very clear message and signal to markets that comes out of COP28. We are running out of time here, and I want to make sure that Lisa and Leo have a chance to let you know anything else that they think is really critical to be picking up from Energy Day in particular, and from what we've had over the Leaders Summit and the start to the detailed negotiations on the GST text. So I'm going to move us now to doing some of those final thoughts. Lisa, do you want to kick off with the last messages that you want to make sure everyone's hearing about where we go to next on the energy package out of the COP?
Perhaps just also to flag from today that there's also been real momentum behind energy efficiency and a call to action on energy efficiency from a big group of businesses and civil society institutions led by emission efficiency. So do look out for that. And we also expect more news from the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, I think, straight after this. So have a look at that. And other than that, as I said beforehand, I think all eyes are on Al-Jaber, what he's delivered, and a sort of cheekily packaged up on Saturday on oil and gas with that was quite weak, with some really fantastic stuff on the clean energy side. His role as the president and actually being an honest broker and making some of this more detailed conversation possible that we just talked about on abatement, on finance, and on equity. He needs to create space for that with the spirit of an actual outcome on what so many countries have said, which is fossil fuel phase out in the whole package. So all eyes on him. Leo.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I would agree with everything that Lisa has just said. I suppose the way that we're seeing it is that nothing is off the table yet. The most ambitious outcome for the energy package is still very much in play. And as Alex alluded to, there is already clear language in there. It's not like we're going to need to necessarily create a whole new set of language in the next round of negotiations that will then go up to ministers in order to get to the most ambitious point. There is language in there that can be built out. So we are of the opinion that we should be expecting and pushing for the presidency to be able to deliver on all of the components of the energy package. So this will require the countries that have the money, the G7 and the wider OECD, to continue to demonstrate that they are willing to support a global transition in order to build that confidence, and the presidency to demonstrate that they are capable of leading and coordinating a process that gets through all of these technical tricky issues, and then gets through all of the political tricky issues that are to come when the ministers arrive. We think that's feasible. So all eyes on the presidency. The deal is there to be had. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leo. And we have a pretty big team on the ground here and some others tracking at home, looking at other parts of that global stocktake response. We've particularly been following this new buzzword around unilateral measures and how trade and climate comes into the negotiations, and the potential for that to block some of the global stocktake response if it's not managed well by some of the developed countries. And our experts are following what's happening on finance and adaptation and loss and damage. So if you have any other questions, please do reach out to us at press@e3g.org. We're very happy to answer your questions. And this will have been recorded and will go up on our rolling blog as well. So if you need to refer back to it, you can find it there. We look forward to chatting with you again in our WhatsApp blast and for our next summary of what's been happening at the COP. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.